It used to be that historians did not concern themselves with the motivations and beliefs of common folks. And it's not because we didn't think they were interesting, but because we did not think that they were particularly important. We assumed, I mean, historians in the past assumed that people at the top, people in positions of leadership, influence, power, made the decisions that shaped the lives and actions of the people below them. We no longer believe that this is how societies work, and consequently, we're now very much concerned with, we concern ourselves much more today with the lives of the masses of people lower on the socioeconomic scale. And this shift, which was responsible for the birth of social history, history from below, the shift took place not because we now see common folks as more interesting or admirable or relatable than great men, in captains of industry, the state, the army, the arts, academia, but rather because we see common people as more important. Okay, so it's not that we used to think that kings and presidents were more interesting, and now we think that common people are more interesting. Rather, we used to think that kings and presidents and generals were more important because they shaped the world that other people lived in. Whereas we no longer think so. And today, we actually see the masses of common people as more important than kings, presidents, generals, and captains of industry. The major developments in our history, the agricultural revolution, the military revolution, the industrial revolution, the market revolution, nationalism, capitalism, socialism, the mobilization that won World War II, the Cold War, the sexual revolution, just the digital revolution, all these great developments, I mean, not great as in fantastic, but great as in thoroughgoing changes in our lives, we no longer understand them as products of one person's bright idea or initiative. Like, we no longer think of the digital revolution as the product of Steve Jobs, or we understand that this is a mass movement, okay, that with literally millions of contributors. So we now, historians and lay people alike, so it's just the whole society, including the historians, understand that these movements are, or these changes, these developments, are products of grand impersonal forces, such as demography and climate and changes in diet and disease and literacy levels and changes in the ether of the culture, and changing patterns of production and changing patterns of transportation and commerce. So we believe that historical events and developments occur because of the cumulative effect of millions and billions of small local interactions, not because of a decision someone made at a cabinet meeting or the boardroom of a central bank. Okay? Capitalism came into being not because someone invented it and created policies to further it. And the same with the sexual revolution, and the same with the internet. So the great men that, again, the captains of society that used to be the focus of our histories are now seen as operating within these vast impersonal forces of demography, technology, transportation, climate. So these people, the Abraham Lincolns and Winston Churchills, etc., operate within the vast impersonal forces that shape society and culture and the economy around them. And that is why historians argue that we need to study the society, study thousands and millions, rather than limit our investigation to a handful of individuals at the top. Because it's these millions who shape a society, not the handful of people who form its political, cultural, economic, military, and intellectual elite. And yet, some of the intellectual habits of that previous mindset clearly still remain. Yeah. When we look at popular violence, like riots, popular revolts, lynchings, and things like that, we conceive of it as a senseless, out of control convulsion of lawless violence. Okay? This is a view of street violence from the top. This is how people from the top, like us, look at street violence from above. Okay, and there was a famous historian, one of the kind of great lights of the industry, by the name of E.P. Thompson in the mid-20th century, who was one of the founders of social history. And he wrote a wonderful article titled The Moral Economy of the English Crowd, in which he analyzes crowd actions like bread riots, or riots in general. And he shows, even to resistant readers, like I was when I first read it, that these riots were not anarchic looting parties, but rather that they were purposeful enforcement of an economic code of behavior. Okay, that a bread riot was violent, but it was not an exhibition of lawlessness. It was instead an exercise in law enforcement. The rioters did not storm the miller's shop, beat him up, break his equipment, take the flour and anything else of value that they wanted. Instead, they took the flour and left what they were violent. They overcame his resistance, but they took the flour and they left what they thought was a fair price. So again, the equipment was broken. The miller was beaten up. It was ugly. But the crowd action shows that they had a political philosophy in their heads. Okay, this was not theft or robbery in the sense that it was an overthrowing of the law. Okay? Instead, it was a violent enforcement of the community's customary code of behavior in the marketplace. Okay? They were acting out their political philosophy by punishing the miller and the baker and teaching them what the customary law is in trade in this community. Okay? And so in beating up the miller and the baker, they were teaching all the members of the community, including the miller and the baker, the rules of commerce in this community. So the fact that these country bumpkins didn't write erudite tracts about political philosophy does not mean that they did not have a political philosophy. Okay? It was articulated, their political philosophy, their understanding of the marketplace, of the duties and responsibilities of different members of this community and how we should interact with one another, was articulated not as a political philosophy, but as violence. But this E.P. Thompson demonstrates, again, even to a resistant reader, that this violence communicated a political philosophy lesson. And this lesson was was understood by members of the community. Educated people, including historians and political scientists, obviously, we all know theoretically that uneducated people are real people with brains and political ideology and political philosophy. Okay, so we historians and political scientists and philosophers, we know this theoretically, but we often forget. Okay, and that's how we come up with storylines like that book of, what's the matter with Kansas, and storylines like false consciousness and public panic and terms like sheeple and tribalism to explain the political behavior of less educated people. Okay. E.P. Thompson and the other founding fathers of social history rebuked us, or would rebuke us if they were alive today. They would rebuke us to stop being so dismissive and condescending towards people. Because not only is it unbecoming, but worse, it's ignorant. Because those people, those people's ideas and ideology and worldview, their understanding of the law and the Constitution and of religion and morality are as worthy of study as those of educated folks like us, who write down who write our ideas about religion, Constitution, the law, etc., morality, who write it down in articulate and intellectual format. Okay? And in fact, if we were honest with ourselves, we'd apply that logic that I told you about before about studying common people, and admit that actually the ideas of those people, the worldview of those people, and their understanding of the law and the Constitution and religion, etc., are actually more worthy of study than the people who write these, than the class of people who write them down in intellectual format. Yeah, because we really do think that societies and economies work from the bottom up more than from the top down. Now, this issue of what do common people think and what makes them do what they do is a problem in the study of the American Revolution, because historians have long found it easy to explain the reaction of colonial elites to the parliamentary, to Parliament's imperial reforms of the 1760s and 70s. Okay, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, et cetera, et cetera. So historians have been able to put together a narrative, an interpretation of why the rich and powerful, okay, the rich and those families that sat in the colonial assemblies, why they pushed back, why they resisted these parliamentary reforms. Okay? And this is because historians could point to the ways that the imperial reform movement, these imperial reforms threatened the elites' economic interests, their commercial enterprises, and their political influence, their political dominance in their local communities. Not to mention the jurisdictions, the powers of the colonial assemblies that they controlled. Okay? So it's common to hear that the American Revolution was launched in pursuit of the material and political interests of the rich and powerful in the colonies. Now, as a side note, it's not clear to me how it necessarily served their material interests to leave their lives of privilege and comfort and wealth to lead a suicidal revolt against the world's most deadly military power. But I can see how people make this claim in retrospect. After they win the war and go on to become more powerful and rich and everything else, you can say, oh, okay, that was the goal. We take the victory in the war for granted, forgetting that it was actually, at the outset, quite a suicidal undertaking. But put that observation aside, because I do understand how in retrospect, you kind of forget that the war could have been lost as well. In any case, the problem with this explanation, though, the real problem, is that we have good evidence of widespread support from below for these elite families who led the revolution. Okay, so historians have a ready-made they have a ready explanation for why the rich and powerful launched this revolution. But they've had a hard time explaining, okay, so what moved common people, hundreds of thousands of them, to make common cause with these elites? Okay, so why did people, if the imperial reforms threatened the power and the commercial and financial and the material interests of the rich, why did the poor join in? They didn't have these commercial and political interests, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so why did people in the middle and lower rungs of society, people who did not sit on the assemblies, people who, in most cases, didn't even vote, didn't qualify to vote for political representatives in the assemblies, why did these common folk care about and feel so threatened by the policies that Parliament initiated in the realm of high politics and commercial regulation, et cetera? One obvious answer, to go back to what I was saying earlier about how we try to understand, or how dismissive we are about the actions of uneducated people. So one obvious answer, and actually it's fairly common in the historiography, is that common people are dopes who were duped by the elites. Okay, they're victims of false consciousness. They couldn't comprehend what their own self-interest was, et cetera, and therefore they were co-opted, they were persuaded against interest to support the interests of their social superiors. Personally, I don't believe that only rich people can understand reality properly. Then again, maybe I'm not rich enough yet. Maybe I'll understand. Maybe I'll understand this logic when I become wealthier. But beyond what I or you believe about the cognitive abilities of poor people to understand the world they live in, those who make this claim about false consciousness, about the poor being victims of false consciousness and being duped into supporting something that didn't benefit them, and fighting against something that didn't threaten them, these people have to show actual evidence that the poor did not understand the issues and did not have a coherent explanation for their political leanings and actions. Okay, so going back again to what E.P. Thompson said about poor people and what motivated them to use violence in pursuit of what they perceived as their interest, propriety, law, custom, etc. So what evidence could demonstrate that poor people didn't understand the issues and did not have a coherent explanation for their political actions. It's hard to find evidence that proves this, and without evidence, you're left with your own belief about the poor being dopes or being easily manipulated, and rich people being intelligent and clear-eyed and successful Machiavells in kind of pulling the strings of the poor. Okay, it's a belief system. It's hard to find evidence that is convincing for an open-minded juror. Okay? So I haven't, in those books that line up this kind of class division between knowing, purposeful elites and duped middle and lower class Americans, I haven't seen convincing evidence or any real evidence to support the argument that the poor were duped into supporting this rich man's war. You know, a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, that kind of formulation. And so what I can offer to answer this question of why the poor joined this fight in mass numbers and really sacrificed a lot for the revolution. I have a different explanation, which does include evidence for the actions and the political leanings of the middle and lower classes. And this explanation hinges on the drastic attack on on Parliament's drastic attack on jury trials in America. So in 1700, Parliament transferred cases of piracy, of piracy on the high seas, not at port, but transferred cases of piracy, piratical attacks that happened beyond the jurisdiction of any one government, transferred them from civilian courts and civilian juries to admiralty courts, which were military tribunals of the Royal Navy, in which the verdict was pronounced not by a jury, but by an admiralty judge, a military judge. So this was in 1700, a controversial innovation at the time because it claimed royal jurisdiction at sea, which was a novelty, and something that was not accepted by seagoing people and maritime communities, and even courts of law and educated jurists into the 19th century even. Okay, so that's one reason why it was controversial. But also, it took away it invaded the jurisdiction of local courts. Okay, up until then, local courts had the jurisdiction to try these cases and decide them. And so establishing these courts was an attack, kind of took a bite out of the authority, the jurisdiction of local courts, and it upended common law precedents about this issue of jurisdiction at sea. And most controversially, it purposefully denied English subjects who were accused of piracy the hallowed right to face a jury of their peers, to be tried not by a military judge arbitrarily, but to be judged by a jury of their peers. People like them, people who shared their circumstances, who lived where they lived and shared their beliefs, etc., including their legal beliefs. And in fact, the reason why Britain or England created these military tribunals was because local juries routinely acquitted accused pirates in these civilian courts. Okay? So the Crown didn't like the results, and so it said, forget it, we're not letting you try these cases anymore. We're going to give give these cases to military judges, take them out of the hands of juries. Okay, so this was controversial, but it was only in piracy cases on the high seas. And so English people in England and in North America kind of swallowed it. After the French and Indian War in the 1760s, in the face of similar acquittals by juries of accused smugglers and other illegal traders and people who traded with the enemy during the war, the Sugar Act of 1763 extended the jurisdiction of those admiralty courts to cover not just piracy on the high sea, but also customs offenses, smuggling offenses, taking place at port. Okay, so all the way to the shoreline. So cases of smuggling, contraband, trade, and trafficking with pirates, trafficking with smugglers, illegal trade, trade with the enemy, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so again, the British authorities didn't like the fact that civilian juries were acquitting people accused of smuggling and trading with the enemy, et cetera, and so said, okay, we're going to take these cases away from local courts and local juries as well. So the result, so this covered a lot more cases than did just that Piracy Act from 1700. This had real consequences for a broad swath of Englishmen. So it meant that a colonist accused of murder or rape would have the benefit of a trial by jury, okay, to be tried by a jury of his peers. Whereas a man accused of a customs violation, smuggling, would find himself on trial for his life in front of a military tribunal, no jury. Okay, so this was very offensive and very scary for people. People resented it. People were fearful of the consequences because they feared the arbitrariness of facing a military judge, whereas they trusted civilian juries to understand their circumstances, to share their legal beliefs, etc. Then in 1765, the Stamp Act extended the jurisdiction of admiralty courts further to cover also violations of the Stamp Act. So American settlers first saw their local courts, local magistrates, local juries supplanted by military tribunals of the central government in London in matters relating to commerce at sea, or just piracy at sea, where the jurisdiction of local courts was indeed kind of tenuous and shaky. Do they have jurisdiction out there in the high seas? Then, immediately after the war, the British extended the jurisdiction of these military tribunals all the way to the shoreline, where the jurisdiction of local courts had been undisputed for generations. And then soon after that, admiralty courts seized jurisdiction over violations that took place hundreds of miles inland and had nothing to do at all with maritime trade, the Stamp Act. Now, historically, local communities in America, in the colonies, used their courts to check, to limit the enforcement of imperial policies and laws that they found either to be bad or illegal or unconstitutional. Okay, so laws that they thought were illegal or unconstitutional, they simply acquitted accused perpetrators, like, for example, smugglers and pirates. The reforms that Britain initiated in the administration of justice made it harder for colonists to continue doing this. And not only were local juries unable to shield colonial smugglers and illegal traders from prosecution, they also couldn't punish assertive or abusive customs officers. Previously, customs agents had been intimidated from pursuing their duties aggressively for fear of being taken to court where they met hostile juries that were quick to convict them. But in the post-war years, Britain permitted imperial officials, like customs officials, to avoid local juries by choosing to transfer their trials from the colonies to London, okay, to be tried by a London jury rather than by a New York jury or New Bern jury or Boston jury. So it was these kinds of daily experiences of British imperial administration, rather than philosophical abstractions on the nature and purpose of government, that shaped colonists' political sensibilities and constitutional complaints in the 1760s and 70s, leading to the revolution. So certainly many Americans, I'm sure, I know, read tracts of political philosophy and moral philosophy about taxing powers and government by consent, et cetera, et cetera. But most colonists came to consider issues of consent, representation, the will of the governed, jurisdiction, arbitrary power, the rule of law, simply because they or their relatives or their colleagues or their neighbors had crossed paths with customs agents or soldiers or officers of the court. And so it was the imperial government's post-war law enforcement campaign that focused the attention of a wide cross-section of colonial society, including middle and lower class colonists, sailors, consumers, dock workers, et cetera, on, it focused their attention on constitutional issues, on the constitutional issues that sparked the war. Again, arbitrary power, customary, the power of local populations to govern themselves. Again, government by the will of the people. So imperial law enforcement, this imperial law enforcement campaign, did a great deal to educate common people on the contours of the ongoing dispute between Parliament and American assemblies regarding provincial liberties and the imperial constitution, how this empire is constituted, who wields power at the local level, for example, versus, what's the power division between the central government and the lower government, admiralty courts versus lower courts, et cetera. The threat to jury trials affected sailors and innkeepers and shopkeepers and dock workers, just as it did ship owners and merchants. And it made the constitutional principles over which the assemblies and parliament argued understandable and personal to common folks who were not political. The attacks on the attack on jury trials illustrated to Americans that these abstract constitutional principles were not a matter of high politics. They had real, direct, and life-threatening impact on them. And it should come, therefore, as no surprise that of the 10 items that comprise the American Bill of Rights, 5 of the 10 amendments protect Americans in their dealings with federal courts of law. And 3 of them, the 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendment, explicitly protect Americans' right to jury trials against federal infringement. Ever since this issue of jury trials was a big issue for American colonists and before the Revolution, and it taught them to be wary of the central government's possible infringement on this sacred right. And therefore, when they formed their own government, it was important to Americans to put it in writing that the central government shall not restrict or infringe on this right to jury trial. Because ever since the Middle Ages, Englishmen saw the right to be tried by a jury of their peers as their birthright. They took pride in it as a hallmark of liberty, and they saw the absence of jury trials in France, for example, as emblematic of French tyranny and arbitrary power. This devotion to juries was intimately connected to the English attachment to representative legislatures. These two things were linked as the primary forms of English self-government. Just like English legislatures, juries empower representatives who share the defendant's circumstances, interests, values, and understanding of the law. And like representative legislatures, juries reflect that core English conviction that people with power will abuse it. And that's why both legislatures and juries prevent the concentration of power in the hands of one person. Okay, they disperse power among many representatives. And in fact, if you think of it, for most people, the issues of liberty outlined in the Magna Carta or the English Bill of Rights became palpable not on voting days, but when they or their acquaintances found themselves in court. In comparison to voting for political representatives, jury trials offered practical liberty and direct self-government, of which the consequences were immediately visible and incomprehensible in a community's daily life. Not to mention the fact that most people in Britain and in the colonies were not eligible to vote, but everyone was eligible to face prosecution. So we know that the British attack on the ability of local courts and local juries in America to administer justice was a huge issue in the provincial protests of the 1760s and 70s. And it's a shame or a problem that modern historical accounts of these protests focus mostly on economic regulations and on the conflict between the colonial legislature and parliament. Okay, so issues like the economic burden of taxes, the trade restrictions, stamp fees, and issues of high politics, again, of political philosophy, structure of government, et cetera, et cetera. And so these modern accounts focus primarily on the things that wealthier Americans, that American elites were concerned about. But what really motivated Americans, both high and low, was the threat to self-government. Okay? The liberties of the assemblies on the high end, and the liberties, the powers of juries on the low end. Okay? The sense that self-government in the assemblies and in juries were under threat was the most visceral concern that animated American resistance. It wasn't the taxes. It wasn't the financial aspect of the taxes. Wealthy and poor alike, especially those who made their living at sea and at the docks, saw this constitutional issue as a real threat once customs enforcement intensified during and after the French and Indian War. Thus, when the Stamp Act Congress met in 1765 to petition the king to repeal both the Sugar and Stamp Act as unconstitutional, the Stamp Act Congress issued a list of grievances over the loss of American liberties, and chief among these was the right to a trial by jury. So again, historians have long emphasized the role of legislatures in colonial in the colony's political and public life. These studies have fostered an impression that people's lives were organized primarily or significantly by the colonial legislature. But we need to keep in mind that that legislatures served for only a few weeks per year, and they did not reach deep into daily life in the towns and villages and farms of America. Most of the governing on the local level, establishing what was permissible and what was not, was done through the courts, through local courts and common law. Okay, it was the courts that regulated most issues that shaped daily life on the farm, in the town, in the county. And so this understanding of the presence of courts in daily life and in local communities compared to the presence of the colonial assembly in daily life and in a community's life places the colonists' strong attachment and fear, strong attachment to juries and fear about the British attack on American juries, places it in a better perspective. Okay? And again, we don't have to be historians to understand this. We don't have to kind of reach in and try to understand common people back then to see why they were so connected to juries. Okay? If you look at your life here today, at Americans Today, you'll be able to see why the jury is the most basic and most important function of government and most impactful form of self-government. Okay, because certainly we all like to have a fraction of a voice in deciding who will represent us in the city council and the state legislature and the national legislature and the White House. Okay? And by having a fraction of influence on who occupies that office, we then have a fraction of influence over public policy, over what our tax burden will be, what our environmental policy or educational or energy policy will be, whether we're going to go to war, whether the Treasury will bail out some American company, etc. But I think we all understand that these policies are, they have an influence on our lives, certainly, but it's not truly impactful in our private lives. It's certainly not as impactful and not nearly as impactful as a prosecutor who hauls you to jail, indicts you for a crime, and threatens to take from you your life savings, your ability to make a living, your good name among your friends and neighbors, your professional reputation among your clients, and your colleagues, threatens to take your children from you, taking your freedom or your life. Okay? So it's at that point, when you're in the courtroom, either as a plaintiff or as a defendant, that self-government goes from being ceremonial and conceptual, as it is in the voting booth, and becomes a real and truly impactful thing in your life, a practical life and death issue, or even less than life and death. So in the courtroom, most people throughout history and around the world today have been subject to the arbitrary power of a state-appointed judge. Okay? But Americans have a system that allows the people to administer justice themselves through the jury system. Now, most people around the world think that the jury system is completely bizarre and kooky. And I thought so when I was a foreigner. But when Americans face a state prosecutor somebody who wants to take their dearest possessions from them, they'd rather have their fate decided by 12 of their civilian peers than by a single person who is an agent of the state and who does not share their background, their living circumstances, and their understanding of the law. So, so when we study self-government in early modern England and in America, we should focus first and foremost on the courtroom, where juries and grand juries performed a more profound and impactful form of self-government than did voters and legislators. Because juries did more than merely decide civil and criminal cases. They performed on the local level many of the functions that we associate with legislatures, such as making the will of the people known to the authorities, proposing new legislation, criticizing government corruption and abuse. I'm talking about grand juries and juries. And promoting the interests and welfare of their communities. And also, given the common law culture in which they operated in the 18th century, juries also actually created law through their rulings. And so our focus, we should devote a lot more focus, a lot more attention to the complaints of Americans about the threat to jury trials. First, because they really did complain about it, and it gets lost in our modern narrative because we're so focused on the concerns of rich people. Again, the assemblies and economic regulation and taxation, etc. But also because we really do think that it's important to understand, as I said at the beginning, we really do believe that it's important to understand what, the mindset of common people, okay? The hundreds of thousands of people who made the revolution what it was. And dismissing the actions of all these millions or hundreds of thousands with false consciousness, or just leaving it as a blank space that we don't really understand why they did what they did. So we're going to focus on Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, goes against our method as historians and our beliefs in our society about how societies work and how historical events come into being. So if we want to understand the American Revolution, we need to understand these people, and these people will be more comprehensible to us if we focus on the things that they focused on, rather than on the things that the elite focused on.